Hey everybody, this is Julia. I'm a product manager at the Product Management Festival. Welcome to our third edition of PMF Connect. And right now I'm going to switch to Grace, my colleague, the moderator of the evening.
Thanks, Julia. Hi, I'm Grace Chimolu from Product Management Festival, and I'm joined by my colleague, Julia Pornela. We're here today for our third PMF Connect session, Challenges of Implementing a Product Growth Strategy. And our guest host today is Chris Long from Shopify. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, we have these sessions on a monthly basis, and the idea is that we allow us to continue the conversation that happens from the annual PMF event, and so that we can continue the conversations from there. So one of the things that we like to do is have the guest host speak on the topic for a few minutes, share their thoughts, and then we'll be able to answer your questions. You can ask them through the chat window, and then we'll be sure to get them to you. We'll get back to you on them. And so we'll go ahead and introduce Chris. Our guest host is from Shopify, and he leads the product growth team there. Over the last 4 years, he's developed a team that's focused on growing Shopify through product. And he has a unique background in product management and development, and that allows him to have a really great, unique combination of being able to address product with growth. At last year's PMF event, he had a topic that was called How to Lose Your Hair and Grow Your Product. And Chris has a degree in computer information science and mathematics and is based out of Toronto. So Chris, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So could you share with us a little bit more about what you do at Shopify?
Yeah, definitely. I think you sort of summarized there a little bit, but so I started Shopify about 4 years ago, and we'll sort of go into it a little bit, and I've got a presentation that I just want to run through, a little bit of the history of product growth at Shopify. But I started with a problem, and it's like, how do you get the product team and the growth team to actually align and talk together? Ended up building a team around it, as you mentioned. And then last year actually shifted a bit more into the product side of things. So I'm actually leading a team of products that we're focused on building out to capture people before they start using Shopify, earlier in the entrepreneurial journey. So it's a bunch of products, very sort of more startup-like, that we're working on that are outside of the normal Shopify product. And that's really been my focus for the past year at Shopify.
That's great. Apologize for the muting there. Thank you very much. So I'll also, I'd love to also know a little bit more. You've made a couple mentions before from when I've heard you talk as well about product growth manager versus product manager. And perhaps you might talk a little bit about this as well when you share your thoughts, but just to help set the table here in terms of everybody understanding what you mean when you're referring to those two. It'd be really helpful if you actually could just give a brief description of what you mean by the two.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's it might be called growth product manager, product growth manager, product manager growth. There's all sorts of different terms out there. The idea really comes down to is generally product managers are focused in on building more value for users. So thinking about what are the features that we can add, how can we change the experience to add more value on a per user basis. With product growth or any of the other related titles that might be out there, it's more about how do we get more people to use the products. Actually, how do we get more people to start using and actually get to the point of getting that value that the other team's building. So they're both thinking about the experiences that person goes through. It might be different tools. So product growth manager might be thinking more potentially email, website, maybe even customer support. But they're also thinking about that product experience as well. So they're kind of playing around with the same stuff, just focused on slightly two different goals there.
That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, so I know that you have a few thoughts to share about the topic, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. And for anyone who's just joined us, the topic is on challenges of implementing a product growth strategy. And please feel free at any time to ask questions through the chat window, and we'll get to them. But for right now, let me go ahead and turn it over to Chris.
Awesome. All right, let's see. Screen share here. All right, can everyone see my screen? Okay, so start off with just a few comments around true and false. Kind of silly, but just get us into it. So first of all, product has value if no one uses it. And hopefully everyone out there realizes this is false. It's all potential value unless someone's actually using your product and getting value from it. On the other side here, we've got growth is something that happens outside the product. Once again, hopefully you answered false to this, and sort of recognize that growth is something that happens across the board for everything. So one of the things that generally comes up in my experience with this is what's the difference between growth and marketing? And it's an important distinction, and I think it's worthwhile to call out here. So quickly go into it. Growth is focused on connecting more people to the value of your product. It's something I just mentioned earlier. And the idea here is that that's the outcome. Marketing, it's all tactics, channels, tools. You hear about digital marketing, email marketing, but that just limits you to that set bucket of tools. So if you're doing email marketing, you can generally only do email marketing. Or if you're digital ad marketing, you can only do the digital ads. So it's more that tactics, channels, and tools. Growth is that outcome. And this comes up, Craig Miller, who's now our Chief Product Officer at Shopify, way back when he joined actually as our VP of Marketing, he actually changed the team name to Growth, became the VP of Growth. And in a HubSpot interview on a podcast a few years ago, this is a quote that he said. And this is really like having that clear goal, that outcome of growth. That's why we call it the growth team here at Shopify or elsewhere around the industry. And just quickly make it even clearer for you, a lot of organizations kind of operate this way where they have a marketing focused on leads, trials, emails. There's a wall, and they throw those over into the product side things. And that ends up being either side's fault. So product might complain that marketing is sending them poor quality customers or vice versa. What we're aiming for with the growth team is actually combine that entire funnel to actually create that uniform thing there where it's growth and product, they can impact the entire funnel. It's a seamless experience between those two. And that results into the idea of what we spoke about, where product teams focus on building value, growth teams focus on getting more users to experience and keep experiencing that value, and they work together across the entire experience. So what is product growth? So here, slightly screwed up the formatting, but a product is a holistic experience that provides value to your customers. Could be, let's say, for example, Facebook. So you have a product, years ago would have been called the Facebook. You would have had one product team working on it, maybe one product manager. I don't actually know back then. Years later, it started to subdivide in, and you now actually have many of these products within this overall product of Facebook. And the idea here is that products are many tiers. Like it's kind of like a nesting doll where a product could be the newsfeed, it could be Facebook, could be the ad on the newsfeed. It just keeps on nesting down. And that's sort of a similar concept that we can apply to the funnel. So when you have the funnel, everything from someone finding out about your product, starting to use it, signing up for it, and then the retention, you can actually subdivide that down into individual funnels. You can kind of imagine each one of these funnels within that bigger funnel up there. It's just hard to draw small funnels within the big one. But each one of those small funnels, that's what we're thinking about with product growth. So how can we take a product that we have and think about that funnel from a unique standpoint and apply it to the bigger funnel? And that's what product growth is doing. We're thinking about these smaller funnels within that larger funnel. And you might have a big growth team focused on that big funnel, but thinking about these individual products is also going to help you succeed. This is another slide, just a reminder around that. Let's get past that one. So very quickly, just building product growth at Shopify. this is the experience that I went through. Shopify, fast-moving organization. This was a team that was a center of a lot of things, so it's kind of messy. There's hundreds of steps that we did, so I'm just outlining a few of them here. But the situation is like, figure out what applies for you, what works for you, and take this as a lesson, not as a guidance around it. If I could go back, or if I had the opportunity to redo this again, probably be very different process than what it was. So as I mentioned, before I started, we had the growth team here in Toronto. 500 kilometers away, we had the product teams in Ottawa. They were talking, but it was very ad hoc, one-on-one, and it became difficult as they continue to scale out. So the problem here was that alignment was more accidental. It wasn't on purpose. It was difficult to actually create that alignment. That's when I was brought in. So I was brought in to be that bridge between those two different groups. I mentioned the problem that I was brought in earlier to solve, which is how do we get the growth and the product teams to work together? So my objective is bring growth thinking to the product team, make sure that the product team is thinking actually about how does this help grow Shopify? How do I get people to use these products? And then vice versa, bring some of that product to the growth team. So the growth team's thinking about how can I use these products, these changes that are happening to help grow Shopify. So I was in this role, was doing it, and the organization kept on growing, and actually got to the point where I'd be in Ottawa, and I'd just be there for 2 days, and I have 30-minute meetings the entire 2 days. It was very much one-on-one. I was working with these people individually, influencing them, working with them to figure out how exactly can we grow their products. And that ran into like 3 big problems. One person doesn't scale, wasn't able to actually, I was just juggling a lot of things, which resulted in actually being really hard to follow up. So I'd follow up on the important things, but a lot of stuff would just drop that ball. It'd be something where someone would be like, oh, that's a great idea, I'll go and do that. But like many things, if you don't follow up and push someone actually doing it, it might not happen. And the other thing as well is it just relies on my personal influence and communication. I had to be there in person, build relationships with these people, build that trust with them as well. And it relied very much on my personal credit in those aspects. So we ended up hiring a team, and we went the approach of actually embedding each one of these product growth managers into product teams. They would actually sit with that team. They would report into me up into the growth organization side of things, but for all effective means they're actually part of that product team. And they were focused on driving that growth of that product, working with that team as well as with the growth organization to make that happen. And it results in 3 big problems. One, it takes a lot of time to build trust. So you're in this organization, within this team, you actually need to build trust with them and start demonstrating the impact that you can have in a way that they understand that impact. And it's also high tension. Growth and product generally, in a lot of cases, are at odds with each other, especially around stuff like the user experience. So it was actually a very high tension role with a lot of risk of burning out or you burning bridges with people you're working with. Lastly, there's an inefficient use of growth resources because you had to spend that time, build trust. You had to go to all the meetings with that team, even the meetings that don't exactly apply to the stuff you're working on. You had to be there. You had to be in those conversations. And if there's a better use of your time somewhere else, it was difficult to actually shift you to work on that because it was so important to be there and building that trust. So last structure, this is kind of what we're doing right now, is really choose your own adventure. It's kind of up to each different of our product organizations, product groups, to figure out what's the right approach for them. So in some cases, we actually have a product growth team with resources assigned, led by a product growth manager or a product manager who's focused in on driving that growth. We might also have a product team that's associated within that product group, and they're both driving the same metrics, same objectives, just going at it the 2 different ways. In other cases, we actually still continue to have a product growth manager embedded and actually assigned to that. And the final case, there might actually be no product growth manager, no one there. It's just up to the product manager, other people on that team to build that relationship and associate with that person. So yeah, we'll see what those problems actually bring up. And last, just a few of the challenges that we ran into here as well. As I mentioned, there's the internal tension. It specifically comes around 2 elements when you work with growth and the product teams. Are we growing at the expense of the user experience? And are we moving too fast? So a lot of cases, it might be where you're making changes that are viewed as negatively impacting the user experience. So for example, it might be when you go to Pinterest.com, on any of the pages, the sign-up modal pops up immediately. That is led by the growth team, that change, but it could be viewed as negatively impacting that user experience. Now, moving too fast, it could be a lot of experimentation. The growth team, we really like to ask the question, what's the worst that'll happen? We like to run experiments around that. Our risk threshold is significantly higher than a lot of people within the organization. So you're going to get that question, are we moving too fast? Are we breaking some of the principles that we hold dear and true? So to solve those two things, the first thing I'd recommend you do, communicate the metrics you're using to measure growth, the success of your experiments. So it might be that if you're looking at using subscribers or customers, communicate that value. It might be daily active users is the one that you're looking at. Make sure you're communicating that, talking about that metric. And also make sure you always have a metric that everyone can look at to represent that quality of the user experience. Could be retention, something that represents that product market fit. Could be number of times that they log into it within the first 7 days. Some kind of metric that sort of represents that quality that the user is actually getting. So you can sort of point at and say, like, yes, we drove up these numbers and you thought negatively impacted growth experience, but this number actually shows that it didn't. You also need to keep building trust. So make sure to communicate with the team what you want to learn and why you're doing that experiment, get their buy-in, and figure out different ways of telling that story, potentially through metrics or numbers, potentially show the dropped conversion rate, or even tell the story of a user who hit that frustrating point. So if you do a user test and someone can't get past a certain point, show that to them and you'll get their buy-in a lot easier. And also be okay with losing some battles. There might be some situations where you really believe something needs to be done, but everyone's pushing back against it. Don't keep pushing on that. Just step away. It'll come back up later on. And you might find another way of actually having that impact that you're looking for there. Another problem that keeps coming up is the idea of working on improvements instead of growth. So this actually comes up more specifically where people want to focus on improving the product, fixing those broken windows before actually worrying about growing the product. And in my experience across the board, I think it's kind of like the idea of like, if you showed your work and you're not embarrassed by it, you waited too long to show it. Exactly applies here. You need to be thinking about how do you grow your product early on in the process, and you should be embarrassed by that if it does. If you think it's too early to show it or grow your product. Resourcing, I'll quickly go through this one, but you may not actually have, if you're working on the growth team, the authority or the resource to implement the changes you want. And it goes back to the idea of the metrics, the building trust, all those other elements that hopefully solve for it, as well as convincing the leaders. So this isn't the managers, this isn't the design managers or the development managers, this is actually the leaders within the team, the people who everyone looks to for approval or how they should react to things. Work with them, convince them that this is something that needs to be done, and you'll find a lot of things become significantly easier, and you're actually able to get that resources that you need. But yeah, so thank you. That's just a short little presentation. And now I guess it's time for questions.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'll remind everyone that if you would like to ask a question, feel free to do so through the chat window, and that way we can get to them. So, Chris, we actually have a question that came through right now, and it's from Simon. How do you measure the user's happiness?
Very much depends on the product, what exactly you're looking for. It could be something like NPS, could be qualitative information you're looking for, could just even be retention. So if you're using a product mobile app, the number of times that they access it is probably a really good means of it. So for example, it could be if I open up Pinterest every single day and I'm actively engaged on it for a certain period of time. That's another example, Instagram. That's a great, like that's probably I'm happy with it, or at least I'm getting some value from it. I want to keep on using it. So a metric like that is really useful. But once it sort of depends on your product, what exactly you're aiming to achieve. It could be time, could be bounce rate, could be Yeah, a variety of different things, but they're all out there, and just figuring out what the right one to use is really important for you to actually continue to have that influence and show the impact of the work you're doing.
And I imagine that perhaps because you have product growth team, different product growth managers on the different teams, that perhaps the user happiness or success metrics or all those could differ depending on the product or even what the team's wanting to measure. So perhaps it's actually each group has to determine what those KPIs are themselves, or do you feel like sometimes you need to have some pretty overarching ones that as a whole everybody is trying to strive for?
At the scale where Shopify's at, I think it's we are at that point where we do have individual metrics that we are taking a look at. It's important to be that very specific to the situation. Probably for a lot of smaller organizations, having just one metric is really important. It's something you can sort of use as the North Star metric for the entire organization when it comes to user happiness. So it does depend on the scale of the organization and what's that situation that you're in there.
Okay. Thanks. So I love the image that you showed of the funnels and the baby funnels. Sorry, mini funnels. Could you go a little bit? Would you mind sharing a little bit more? What are the inputs? Maybe a couple examples. It'd be great. I think there's a lot there where you're mentioning how really when you're thinking about it from a growth standpoint, you're actually not looking at just one big funnel, but all the smaller ones.
Mm-hmm. So let's take, for example, two different products at Shopify. So let's say one of our sales channels, point of sale, for example. So with point of sale, you might actually have a lot of people who find out about it through the advertisements, email. They're net new to Shopify, and they're coming in and they're starting out with Shopify point of sale. So that becomes sort of the starting point of that funnel. And that's the type of audience that the product growth person might be looking at and focusing in on is new people to Shopify and getting them in and getting them starting to use Shopify point of sale and getting them through those steps. And then it might be we start getting them to use our online store or other channels or other features on top of that. There might be another one of our products. Let's take shipping. So we offer the ability to purchase shipping labels within Shopify. It might not make, like, someone's not going to come to Shopify because we offer shipping labels. They're going to come to Shopify because we offer a whole bunch of other stuff. So that's much later in the process. So it's actually like probably once you get your first order is now when you start entering that funnel and you start going through those steps. So you can sort of like break it down into those. It might be like for some, it's just a small slice of the entire funnel. It might be where it starts at the middle of the funnel down to the bottom of the funnel. It could be kind of all over the place that you're sort of thinking about working on things, but you need to figure out where's that start point that really matters for me, where I can actually have impact. So as like shipping, top of the funnel, people brand new to Shopify, doesn't make sense for them. Let's worry about it many steps down and have that person focusing on actually people, the audience that are actively using Shopify who have orders, who want shipping at that point.
That makes sense. Thanks.
No problem.
So you're mentioning about the product growth managers and how some of them in your hybrid model probably is where it ends up being. You have some folks that get them, some teams that get them, some who don't. So how is it determined? Is it because there has been a mandate from above that says this product group we need to grow? Or is it they're applying for a product growth manager? Are you deciding, I think this team really needs it? It would be great to know the process by which you determine which teams get assigned a product growth manager.
So in some cases, it might be where it is something that's kind of been mandated, like it's a very much part of our strategic vision. And it might be potentially like our head of product or someone else saying like, hey, we need to grow this because of X, Y, and Z. Let's have someone work on it. Other than that, it's really focused in on how does it impact our North Star metrics for us as an organization. So it might be, how does this actually help us continue to grow Shopify? Potentially it might be from a revenue standpoint, number of merchant standpoint. There's a variety of metrics that we take a look at. We sort of figure out based on if we grow this product, will it actually help us with those North Star metrics and prioritize based off that. Last thing we also look at is kind of like, who are the resources that we have available? Small team. So it's sometimes very dependent. There might be some products that require someone who is an expert in certain areas, maybe around more social side of things, social selling. They might need to be an expert in that. But we don't have anyone on the team with that skill set, so maybe it's not the right area for them. Or maybe they're focused on mobile products, so let's only have them work on mobile products. So it's kind of those three things are what we're really looking at when it comes to prioritizing, figuring out what the products that we focus in on.
I see. Okay. We have a question from Sergio. Thanks for the session. Here's a question. How do you decide when it's time to change the focus from growing to improving the current product?
So if everything was perfect, you'd have people working on both of those things. But it might... So what we've done in the past in some cases is we've sort of done it in waves, where we might spend maybe a month or two working on something brand new, a new feature, something along those lines. It launches. Similar to once the new feature launches, you kind of work on tweaks, bug fixes, recognize some of the issues with it. That's when you also focus on growth. And you kind of then focus like 100% of your time might be on these tweaks, these fixes and growth activities, and it slowly declines maybe over the next few weeks. And you start working on that next new feature that you're going to be launching. It's a process that we've used. It's sort of depends on at the point where you're getting diminishing returns. So if you're trying to grow that product and you're not getting the results that you're expecting, then maybe it's time to either shift your focus to grow something else, or it might be time to actually shift the focus of that team back to building out more features or adding more value, and then come back in with the growth activities later on.
Okay. And he has a follow-up question. How do you sell the idea to executives that it's time to focus on evolving the current product, even though the growth of it, users are using it, for example, is continuously growing?
Ooh, good question. I guess there's two elements to it. In this case, it might be where it's let's say it matters around revenue. So if your focus as an organization, as a company, is actually driving more revenue right now, revenue really comes from two sources that you're going to have. It's the number of users that you actually have paying you money, plus or multiplied by the amount that they're actually paying you. Generally, by building more features, more enhancements, you're actually going to increase that amount of money that they're paying you, because you're actually adding more functionality and features, and you could maybe tier your plans in a way that they'll actually end up paying you more money. The other side of things is actually getting more people to use your product. That's a growth activity. So it might be where it's you have this idea, or you have like demonstrated through either user research, quantitative data, that there's this opportunity for us to build this new feature and people will pay us money for it. That's a good opportunity to then focus in on actually growing that product. You have the data that shows that. If you don't have that information, then you probably should think about that other aspect of how do we get more people to continue using this product and gather more of that information around the entire experience and where you can build those improvements. But it really becomes like, it's almost like you got two levers to pull, and it's just figuring out which is the one you should yank on the most versus the other one. Because in some cases, it might just be growth is the way to do it. Just get more people use it, and they'll keep paying us $5 a month, and we'll just keep on making more money because they're coming in and they're paying us more. More users are paying us $5 a month. Might be another situation where it's actually like, hey, we can make $50 a month by building out this one feature, and our revenue will grow X amount. So let's pull on that lever instead. But that would be very much how I'd set up the situation if it comes up with executives around it on which one you should be focusing in on.
Sure. And so when you're coming onto when you or someone on your team is going on to another team, what tools are you using? I know you've talked about some of the metrics, but I guess maybe if you're able to share anything a little bit more tactically about how the types of tools that you might be measuring when someone on your team joins another team. Do you just come onto the tools that they already are using and you're adding another couple metrics, or are you adjusting, tweaking, or is it something that they're completely doing on their own in terms of what the growth manager is looking at versus the team?
So when they join the team, it's taking a look at all the information that's currently available. Generally, it breaks up in that qualitative, the user research, surveys, aspects like that, or it's the quantitative of actually how are people actively using the product. In a lot of cases, in my experience, my team's experience, when you look at that quantitative data, you're not thinking about it as a funnel. You're not thinking about it, what are the steps that someone has to go through to actually get to that point of getting value, plus that retention side. So that's really the first thing that we do is sort of like go through all the information we have available and very specifically take a look at the metrics we have and organize it around the idea of a funnel. So what are the steps? Like how many people are actually aware of our product? How many people are starting to use it? How many people get from the point of starting to use it to actually getting value from it? And how many people keep on using it again and again and again? And just reorganizing your metrics in that way sort of helps to show where the problem areas, where are the areas where we can focus in. And a lot of people on the team will suddenly be like, oh, hey, now that explains all these, like this idea of a funnel from step by step by step actually makes sense now. And when you say we should be thinking about the onboarding, like now it makes perfect sense. Let's focus in on that. That's a perfect world, doesn't always happen. But thinking about things from that funnel perspective is just a great tool and you want people to be aware of it and thinking about it. The next step there is just once you actually set out that funnel, make sure you're also agreeing on that final point of where they actually get value. So what's the point that actually matters? So it might be they purchase one shipping label. And that's the point where they're actually getting value is just they purchase one shipping label every month. Or maybe it's like they purchase 5 shipping labels. You need to figure out what that is at that point where they're getting value and agree with the entire team on it. And also figure out that happiness metric that we spoke about as well. Hopefully it's already implemented there too. Last thing that I would say that's really important is figure out who are the leaders within the team. In a lot of cases, you'll find there's the captains, the managers, the bosses, but there's always someone else on the team who everyone else looks to. So find out who that person is because they're going to be your ally if you get them onto your side.
Do you feel like some of these teams are not as receptive of having a product growth manager come on board? You had mentioned also that you want to build trust, which I think any new team member coming on, certainly would want to do. But I guess I'm just curious in terms of the reception that product growth managers receive.
I think it's always positive. It's more so what it defaults into is that you have your top part of the funnel. Like you worry about the marketing stuff, we'll worry about the product stuff. But that's not effective. You need to have the ability to impact the entire thing. That's where the trust comes in, is actually building that influence to be able to say to someone like, hey, have we thought about changing this text or changing the flow in this way? Or let's maybe rethink how we do onboarding. Being able to change the product is where that trust really comes into play. And that's probably the biggest difficulty product growth managers have is when they join a team is being bucketed off in this one area instead of actually having the entire experience that they can play around with or have an impact on.
Right. Okay. What do you have any tips? So this is maybe more on the, what not to do. Any tips on what not to do or what to look out for when folks are embarking on, implementing a product growth strategy?
Probably actually like getting everyone's buy-in around it, I think is going to be really important. And make sure that you do a really good job of communicating across the organization, the impact that the team's having in a way that makes sense. But that's probably that one-to-many aspect is really important with a team like this. And that's probably the aspect that I learned the hard way is actually just making sure to communicate across the entire organization, the impact that your team has is especially important in a role like this.
Right. Well, and a lot of folks, I imagine, for example, who are listening in, might not have the ability to have a product growth manager dedicated to them, but they still need to scale. So how do you think that they could do the work that probably someone on your team is dedicated doing, that they can do on top of what they're already doing. I guess I'm trying to say, how might they need to think about it mentally, or what's the shift they might need to do, because probably they're already thinking more from a product manager standpoint to our initial part, but to then also add the product growth manager hat on. What do you think a little bit of the mental shifting or things that they need to think about and might need to come into play?
So I think it's not actually that difficult for product managers to make that change. Like, I know it's something I did. I never was part of a growth team or marketing team until I joined Shopify. That was actually my biggest concern, was joining a team like this, coming from the product management world, and especially more the technical side, like going back to my days as a developer. Probably the biggest, one is the idea of just measuring everything that you can possibly measure when it comes to an experiment. Focus in on learning. So learning is really important here. So every single thing you do should be actually focused not on, yes, it'll hopefully increase your numbers and that sort of stuff, but you should be aiming to learn something with it and walk away, whether it's a failure or a success, that you learn something. Like a true failure of an experiment or something that you're trying out doing is when you don't learn anything at all.
Right.
If you failed, then that's okay. Like, you walked away, you learned something that'll help you improve your next experiment. Probably the other element is just that idea of, it keeps coming up, but the concept of a funnel is just really important to the growth world, and you can see why. If you go out there, you can read all sorts of books. There's all sorts of people talking about growth, but the one common thread across the board with all of them is this idea of a funnel and recognizing where are the areas where you can have the greatest impact, and then looking at that area where you have the greatest impact and figuring out the smallest thing you can do to actually have that massive impact. Like the classic example is like with Hotmail, they had the signature line at the bottom of their email that was like, this email was sent for free via Hotmail or something along those lines. And that was probably the biggest growth thing that they ever implemented, and that was a small thing. Huge the actual act. So think about that too, like simple, small things, and just keep on focusing in on what can you do that actually is simple to drive that change. You can always make it a lot crazier, a lot better after you do that first tweak, but just start something simple and small.
Right. So along the lines with, you were just talking about measuring everything, and I know from also your PMF talk, as well as even from earlier today, data's really important to you. I'd love to talk about that a little bit more. Where do you get your benchmarks? Are you looking at internal benchmarks, external benchmarks, or is it, what kind of data are you using?
More internal. External, I think, is generally pretty dangerous. You never actually know what's behind those numbers. And in a lot of cases, if what works for someone, like let's take conversion rate. So conversion rate can fluctuate up and down depending on, like, if you run, let's say, Facebook ads in India, your conversion rate's probably going to dip quite dramatically because you're increasing the number of leads, but the final conversion might not actually be there. You could have an impact like that where it's, so looking at other people's numbers, dangerous to do. You have the fullest picture of your numbers, so you leverage internal benchmarks when it comes up. In a lot of cases, it's going to be somewhat guesswork on that benchmark aspect. It's just going to be like, hey, like between the step where they start using the product to when they finish setting it up, we're seeing a 40% drop there. That's kind of crazy. There has to be something wrong there. Like, even if we half it, that just improves our numbers dramatically overall. So it's a bit of common sense, gut instinct as well that ties into it there. And it could just be like looking at previous stuff that you've done. And that's where the internal benchmarks that you mentioned could come into play, is just sort of recognizing like, hey, we did, we sent an email after they started using the product, and that resulted in people coming back and finishing off the process at a rate of 50%. We should implement that for this product as well. I'll give that.
All right. And when
I have a question. What so increase? They came back 50%. What was in the email, or what?
So that's just an example, not specifics. Okay. But I think it's something you've seen fairly often. Like where you might install an app, start using it, and then you get the push notification. It's because you get distracted, you forget about it. I don't know about yourselves, but for me, like I'll install an app just on whim, forget I have it installed until I ignore it, until like some point where I'm like flicking around, like, oh hey, I want to try that app. So like they're just like, once someone starts using it, they might be distracted. Be okay with doing like a push notification or email to actually get them re-engaged, getting them back into it. Could just be something simple like, hey, you're only 30 seconds away from finishing this off, or hey, like it's special discount if you finish off this process. Like you can figure out all sorts of things that matter for your product, the hook that gets someone back in. But probably the most important thing that you can possibly do is just being okay with reminding someone that you exist. And just re-engaging them and using, whether it's email, push notifications, text messages, picking up the phone and calling them, like any one of those will work at re-engaging that person, getting them to come back. It's just something.
Do you lose a lot of people when doing this? I mean, sometimes people are just overwhelmed with communication.
It might happen. Like I think it's you need to always be cautious about that overwhelming aspect to it, but not saying sending like an email every single 30 minutes or push notification every 10 minutes, but space it out a little bit. And if they're not engaging with it, if they're not coming back to it, then it's probably not the right time for them to be using your product. Maybe it's a week from now, or maybe if it's a game, time it right. So time it after 5 p.m. So maybe they're bored at work, they install the game. And then they get distracted, they go on work, they can't play the game right now, but you're sending notifications, they're like, no, I'm working, I can't do it. Send it to them at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night on the weekend. Can play around with it in a way that makes it much more contextual and figure out the right timing around it so it actually does have an impact. But yeah, it's not overwhelming. Like overwhelming is the wrong thing to do, but it's being smart about it as well. At the beginning, and this is also, at the beginning, it might be overwhelming. Like you might not have the system in place to do this intelligently. So you might aim to be overwhelming instead of underwhelming. But that's okay. Like if the numbers show that's negatively impacting things, pull it back. Don't be so overwhelming. If they show the other side of things where it's actually having an impact, then keep doing what you're doing.
So I was curious. I'm still going back to the scenario where someone might not have a product growth team manager with them. How do you think the team profile changes, or maybe it doesn't, when it is time to implement a growth plan? So I'm thinking perhaps it's a team that's already in place, and I know we were talking about how mentorship actually is not so quite of a stretch, but to grow, I'm just wondering if you feel like there's a couple team members that either need to be added or not, and just how, if you think that profile of that team might need to shift as they're needing to change their strategies.
Yeah, there might be that case where it needs a shift. Like it's going to be, depending on the people on the team, some people might be very focused on building much more the like elaborate systems, thinking about the full problem, being very resistant to quick tests, quick optimizations, or thinking about even some people might think what they built was perfect and kind of ignoring the metrics that come up around it. Like some of that stuff has been known to happen. And those are the type of people that are going to be very resistant to any kind of growth strategy there. Ideally, that isn't the case. And ideally too, if you're the product manager, you figured out ways of interacting with them or potentially even bargaining with them to help them get on board with actually implementing things. The trick there as well is show the impact that they can have. So start training them out of that thinking of like, we need to do 1 week of prototyping, 1 week of user testing, 1 week of polishing, and then I can finally finish off the designs the 4th week. I'm picking on designers, not meant to, but just this one case. Get them to do something quick and simple, like just say to them like, hey, like, let's just do something quickly. Let's give ourselves a day or two. Let's try it out. and then use the feedback loop of like, hey, it actually had a positive impact. That works incredibly well to help train them out of that mindset and help get the shift in their thinking. Like that's going to be some of the stuff that you're going to have to think about or actually do. And it's similar to like anything you're doing as a product manager. Like you're figuring out different communication styles with different people on your team to accomplish that successful outcome. Just in this case, the successful outcome has changed, and you probably need to break a bunch of habits. So you just need to figure out the right strategy communicating at that group level as well as the individual level to implement that sort of change to actually see it happen.
Yeah, it just sounds like definitely one of the key areas is communication. I can totally understand that too. All right, well, I think let me just check to see if there's anyone else who had any questions. So I think we have addressed the questions that we have. Why don't I go ahead before we wrap up though? Chris, have you share last kernel of wisdom with us?
I think it's the last thing I just sort of share is like growth. It's incredibly important. Like getting more people to use your product, it's often forgotten about, and it's sort of been very negatively viewed. Like growth hacker was a common term that was used over the past call it 10 years in a very negative light. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about growth. The idea of growth is much more sustainable, authentic growth. And don't ignore it. Like, don't focus in entirely on your product experience, improving your product at the detriment of the actual growth. That's why we built a team around it. Shopify, other organizations do it, where you as a sole product manager working on that product, or you as a designer or developer working on that product, be the champion of growth for that product. It's because that's going to be the other lever that you can pull on. We always forget and just pull the one lever about building more value. You can get more people using it, still has as big, if not bigger, impact. Yeah, that would be my last words, but this was fun.
Definitely. Oh, thank you very much. It was really, really great having you, Chris. And thank you all for also joining us for this PMF Connect session. Our next one will be on the 26th of March, and we hope we can see you there as well. This video, in a summary of it, will be made available once it's ready. So until then, we hope you all take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.